Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Subsection 4. So it had come at last, the news of Neville's engagement, for which she had waited so long. She had told herself again and again that it might come at any time, and that it must come sometime. Yet, now that it had come, it brought to her a greater shock than she had anticipated. It seemed curiously disappointing that it should have come in such a way, without the faintest indication of its approach. She had thought, somehow, that she would have been a witness of the first stages of the affair, that she would know the girl herself, that she would watch Neville and see how matters developed, perhaps, even, that she would be the confidant of the girl. 2 or 3 names had passed before her mind as possibilities. For that kind of thing she had been ready enough. She had rehearsed, smiling faintly to herself, little scenes that might have happened. She had even thought that Neville might come and tell her in this very pavilion. Well, he had told her here after all, or rather his letter had told her, but it had not been as she had rehearsed it. She read the name again. Enid Bessington. No, she had never heard of Enid Bessington. It appeared to her curiously disconcerting that anyone called Enid Bessington should be engaged to her nephew Neville. A second disappointment lay in the news that she was not a Catholic, and she made haste to take refuge in this. It was quite a sharp little blow that this was so. Of course, she had faced the possibility, but a possibility is very different from an assured fact. Of course, too, Neville said that she was thoroughly broad-minded, that she had definitely made to him the promises as regarded the Catholic upbringing of the children, if there were any, which she afterwards would renew before the marriage was celebrated. He even said that he thought she might very likely become a Catholic herself, but all young men in love thought that kind of thing. So Anna fixed upon this point as her principal little grievance, as the explanation of her very sharp dismay at the whole news. For she would not have been human after all unless there had always remained in the background of her mind a consciousness that, in spite of probabilities to the contrary, Neville really might not marry. Never for a moment had she ever permitted herself to wish that he would not. It was entirely right that he should. She had expressly urged it, again and again. Yet she was the mother of Jim, after all, and Jim certainly had been heir presumptive ever since he had been born, was in fact still the heir presumptive. Her humanity, therefore, made its subconscious protest, and experienced its subconscious dismay. But it was wholly subconscious. She would not, even this moment of surprise, allow it to be more. 2 points only did she permit to dwell on her mind as disconcerting. One, that Enid Bessington was entirely unknown to her, and the other, that Enid Bessington was not a Catholic. And then, as she turned the last page of the 4, she perceived that she must not allow those to be grievances. Neville was the head of the house. He was perfectly free. He must follow his heart. "Mummy!" She looked up suddenly, and the heir presumptive stood in the doorway. He really was a picture. He had been out riding for a good 2 hours this morning on a small and very determined little pony, that was, for all that, not so determined as his rider. And he was still flushed from that strenuous exercise and from the cold bath that had followed it. He was close on 8 years old, as upright as his mother. He had a singularly fair complexion and straight golden hair, cut like a 14th century page's. It was deplorable to think that by this time next year it would have to be cropped instead. Bright gray eyes like her own, and an exceedingly resolute mouth. He was back in his sailor suit now, barefooted, instead of in the perfectly ridiculous and perfectly charming little riding suit and boots in which he had come to breakfast. Poor little heir presumptive. "Yes, my darling? May I come in?" He said it like a sort of aside, but it was strictly according to rule that he must ask this always when she was here with her letters. He was beaming on the collies as he asked it. "Yes, come in." She watched him first sit down suddenly between the collies, and then roll over in a kind of ecstasy, bringing an arm round each shaggy neck and dragging each long nose down into the back of his head. An indescribable sound rose from the entangled group, of scratching claws, loud excited moans from Jill, the steady good-humored growling of Jack, and long whines of pleasure from the boy. She watched them meditatively. "Well, be dirty again if you like," she said, But remember, you'll have to wash and brush your hair all over again." He sat up, his whole face screwed tight with delight and with the physical ecstasy of having been scratched and nosed all over the back of his neck. "Oh, Mummy," he began. "No, Jill, go away. I don't want you." He pushed her violently in the chest. "Come up here if you want to keep clean. Get down, Jill." He climbed up beside his mother and threw his arms around her waist. "Oh, Mummy," he said, "how jolly it all is." At moments like this, a kind of joy ran through her that very nearly terrified her. Jim's superabundant vitality continually broke out in violent caresses. He would suddenly embrace his pony's nose before mounting and kiss him between the eyes, or he would roll on the ground, as just now, between the collies, or again, it was his mother now and then, whom he fiercely embraced. He was just one tingling 4 foot of life that burst out irrepressibly. He had, of course, as such natures do have, long meditative intervals in which he stared, steadily and unseeing, at some entirely familiar thing, and when questioned, gave what seemed a wholly inadequate subject to occupy his mind so utterly. And then, as abruptly and as inconsequently, he would set his small teeth in a passion of affection and seize his mother, or even Masterson's trousered leg would do, and say how jolly it all was. But at this moment, breaking upon the news that she had just had, and at her knowledge of the amazing change that it registered in his fortunes, his embrace was like a sword for pain. She felt herself suddenly flush, and then she too seized him, pulled him round, and kissed him almost savagely between the eyes. Then, ashamed, she recovered herself. "There, my dear, and now pick up that letter you've just knocked down and give it to me. It's from Cousin Neville, and he's coming back on Saturday. Quick, or Jill'll get it." Subsection 5. Mr. Morpeth, who was coming to lunch, as she had reminded Jim half an hour ago, and in whose honor, therefore, he must be even more speckless than usual, was a man she was beginning to like particularly. At first, he had been a name to her in nothing else. In the long run, she managed most of the estate of which Neville was the official owner, and it was to her, therefore, that the agent had come and reported, 6 months ago, that an exceedingly desirable tenant had applied for the dower house, and that he was a Catholic with 1 daughter, that he was a retired businessman of tolerable wealth, that he had made no difficulties at all, and that, while he would have preferred a longer lease, he was perfectly willing to sign one for a year only, with the first option of renewing it at the same rent every year for 10 years at least. Neville had insisted on these terms in case Aunt Anna might want the house herself. For the first 3 months after his arrival, she had seen no more of him than absolute courtesy demanded. He and his daughter dined with them once, and no more. Ella, the daughter, was just ordinary, who seemed to make no demands on anyone, and her father had appeared to be exactly what he was, a sensible, quiet sort of man, of almost 60, who had obviously been in business, and now, no less obviously, was glad to be out of it and at peace in the country. Anna could have said no more of him than that. She was just aware that he was paying a good deal of attention to his garden. Then there had been some trouble about a son of one of the keepers, who had been arrested for poaching. He was a wild, hopeless kind of boy, exceedingly independent and irresponsible. She had met Mr. Morpeth one day after Mass, and she happened to mention to him her difficulty about the lad. She had talked to him, she said, without the smallest effect, and was in despair as to his future. Then, she scarcely knew how, it had been arranged that Mr. Morpeth was to see him. He had done so, and a day or 2 later came up to report his success. That success, it appeared, had been complete. Dick had capitulated, had promised to enter regular employment, and was to come up to apologize in person. This he did next day. But that was not all. It was the character of a few remarks that Mr. Morpeth had made to herself that had made her for the first time regard him with interest. This whiskered gentleman, it appeared, knew a considerable amount more about human nature than she did, and his manner of speaking of Almighty God, too, had been peculiar. So, little by little, she had begun to understand that Mr. Morpeth was, well, a little beyond her power of understanding. She knew as yet hardly more than that, but she was aware that she would like to know a good deal more. He interested her quite remarkably. Among other things, she had come to the conclusion that he was exactly what she meant by a gentleman, and she meant a good deal by that. Jim had gone in to make himself ready for the second time, and she was still sitting with Neville's letter in her hand, and the rest unopened, when she saw Mr. Morpeth coming across the lawn. She was conscious of a sudden pleasure at the sight of him. Somehow it was reassuring. She stood up briskly to greet him. "Come in, Mr. Morpeth," she said. "The bell hasn't rung yet. Good morning." He looked very ordinary indeed as he came up the steps. He was in his usual grey tailored suit, and carried his Panama hat in one hand and his handkerchief in the other. His high bald forehead shone with heat, and he was a little flushed with walking. There was nothing whatever noticeable about him, except his kindly eyes, and these were not anything extraordinary. "Good morning," he said. "Yes, it's quite warm, isn't it? I came across the grass. The swifts are beginning to build, by the way." "You know all about that kind of thing, don't you?" she said. "I love it too, but I don't know anything." He carefully wiped his forehead once more, and then the inside of his hat, and set hat and handkerchief together on the floor by his chair. Jack rose solemnly and put his nose to them. Then he placed that same nose on Mr. Morpeth's knee and regarded him contemplatively. Mr. Morpeth put a hand on the dog's head. "Yes," he said, "that kind of thing, and Almighty God. Those, I may say, are my business just now." It was just that sort of sentence that had first attracted Anna's attention. At first, she had thought it the peculiar kind of thing converts did say, but she had begun to perceive that it was characteristic of this individual rather than of any general type. He said it quite simply and unaffectedly. She smiled a little and nodded in assent. "I've just heard from Neville," she said. He's coming back on Saturday." "I hope he's better," said Mr. Morpeth politely. "Well, he doesn't say anything about his headaches, and he seems to have been doing a good lot, so I should think he was." "He saw a doctor before he went abroad, you said, I think." "Yes, indeed, I made him, and he must see him when he comes back too, but—" She stopped. Neville had said nothing about keeping the engagement private, and yet she was not quite sure whether he meant her to speak of it. "Yes, you were going to say?" She suddenly decided she would speak of it. That was the kind of effect that this man's presence did have on her. He seemed to her, in his soul at least, to be rather like an experienced priest or a wise doctor. His persuasiveness lay in his eyes, she thought. They were not at all perfect in shape, or exceptionally large, and anything of that kind, but they were narrow and very blue, and exceedingly kindly looking. "Mr. Morpeth," she said, "I may as well tell you. Of course you understand it's confidential until you hear of it from outside, but Neville's engaged himself to be married." "Yes?" "It's what I've always told him to do, of course, but—" "But naturally it's rather a shock, now it has come, because of your boy." That pricked her sharply, and she started. For an instant she thought herself offended. "I quite see that. I cannot imagine it being otherwise," continued Mr. Morpeth tranquilly. "Oh, dear me," she said. "Yes, of course you're right. That does come in, but that's not all." "She's probably a Protestant," observed Mr. Morpeth next. Then indeed she was startled. "How in the world did you know?" she asked. "My dear Mrs. Fanning, it's quite simple. First, you aren't quite happy about it, and next, well, Sir Neville was almost sure to marry a Protestant. You haven't met her, I expect, and that's another point." She laughed outright. "Well, you'd better give me the news instead," she said with an air of mock resignation. "I suppose you can't guess her name?" "That's quite beyond me." "You must tell me," she cried. "How do you guess I hadn't met her? And what in the world do you mean by saying that Neville would be sure to marry a Protestant?" "Well, I guessed you hadn't met her, partly because you didn't mention her name, and I think you would have mentioned it first of all if you knew her. And then I thought from your manner that there was another point you did not quite like, and I could think of nothing else." "Well, it was a very brilliant shot, and perfectly right. And now about the other." For a moment Mr. Morpeth did not speak. He dropped his eyes to Jack, and passed his hand over the smooth head 2 or 3 times. There was no look in his face as if he were aware that he had been at all clever. He was quite natural and quiet. Then he spoke. "Well," he said, "it's most impertinent of me, But since you ask me, I should say simply that Sir Neville struck me, on the 1 or 2 occasions I've met him, as being that kind of young man. He's a little restless, you know. He rather resents being in prison, as he thinks it, and he's very independent, really. Well, that kind of man usually does marry a Protestant, partly because there are a good many more Protestants than Catholics in England, and partly because he would be attracted by their appearance of independence. Sir Neville is not initiated, if I may use the phrase. Up to the last sentence, she understood him perfectly and agreed with him, though never before had she so put it to herself. But she perceived it to be quite true. But the last sentence was beyond her. "What do you mean by initiated?" she asked gently. Again he waited an instant before answering. His hand passed rhythmically over the head still passive on his knee, and beneath the ears. His eyes wandered out for a moment through the open door to the lawns and the great house. Then Jill, who had been watching the caresses with liquid-pained eyes, whined suddenly. "There, go and lie down," he said softly. "Your wife's getting jealous." "Initiated, Mrs. Fanning? Well, I hardly know what other word to use. Well, the difference between your nephew and yourself, if I may venture to say so." As his eyes came round to hers, she was conscious of a sudden flush of pleasure across her bewilderment, and simultaneously understood, or thought she understood, what he meant. Yet it surely was an odd phrase. "Please be more explicit," she said, smiling. "Well, you know," said Mr. Morpeth, "of course I don't profess to say there's a hard and fast line, but it's quite plain, surely, that there is one class of persons on one side and another on the other. The one accepts what happens as soon as it really has happened, and the other does not. The one knows that the past is inevitable, and the other is not sure. The one is not surprised at things, and therefore does not resent them. He is behind the scenes, so to speak, and understands what it is all about, even if he cannot quite make out the details. And the other looks on from the stalls, and knows nothing except what he sees. I suppose that is more or less what I meant just now." "But Neville's a Catholic," said the woman rather inconsequently, as she thought. "Oh, yes, and I cannot imagine his being anything else. But for all that, he struck me as not initiated." She opened her lips to speak, and then closed them again. Simultaneously, the stable bell began to ring. "Well, shall we go to lunch?" she said. Subsection 6. It was nearly 4 o'clock before she found herself alone again in the pavilion, and, somehow or other, the situation wore a very different complexion from that of this morning. At lunch, of course, they had talked of all the things that did not matter. Ella, it appeared, was not yet back from town. The garden of the Dower House was shaping really excellently. Dick Fottrell, the gamekeeper's turbulent son, was doing well on the railway. Jim, too, so admirable was his behavior, demanded a certain amount of conversation. He did not interrupt once while high and grown-up matters were being discussed, but his look of pathetic self-repression made it entirely necessary for the history of the water-hen incident of this morning to be thoroughly reviewed, and for reassurances to be given to the authorities that neither Jack nor Jill had shown any signs of having disturbed a possible nest. Plans also had to be sketched, with a view to Cousin Neville's return on Saturday, and the probabilities debated as to whether he might not possibly, seeing that Jim's 8th birthday came in June, forestall that event by giving him his first lesson in tennis, promised so soon as that date should be reached. Jim, too, had come out with them for coffee into the pavilion afterwards, for the performance of the usual ceremonies with Jack and Jill, who were allowed to lick the inside of the coffee cups clean of sugar, on condition that Jim carefully dirtied them again afterwards. It was Jim's peculiar delight, because it was so beastly, to smell those cups after the dogs had licked them, and indeed the odor of coffee and dog mixed is as startling as a chord crashed on a piano. When at last Jim was gone away to see if Charles the footman would consent to come and bowl to him at the net, the two had begun again. It became more and more astonishing to Anna to find how quickly she was understood by this prosaic old gentleman. Not only did he seem to understand her instantly, but he seemed to be familiar, too, with the processes and grounds that underlay what she had always thought to be small fancies of her own. For instance, She had spoken of the death of Neville's father as being one of the most impressive and terrible scenes she had ever witnessed. It was pretty notorious that he had lived an exceptionally wild life, and that he had died comparatively young in consequence, so she was guilty of no indiscretion in what she said. "What astonished me most," she said, "was my nephew's splendid behavior. His father clung to him, you know, very much at the end. He was simply terrified at the thought of death. Even the priest, it was old Father Benedict we had then, you know, even the priest seemed rather taken aback by some of the things that happened. But Neville, my nephew, I mean, was splendid. He never faltered or showed the least sign of fear, you know. Now what do you make of that, Mr. Morpeth? He was the strongest person there." The old man nodded quietly, without speaking. "No, but tell me," she had said eagerly, "doesn't that look as if he was initiated, as you call it?" He looked up at her questioningly. "Yes, I mean it," she said. "Tell me." "Well, I should think it was his paganism that supported him, not his Christianity." Yes, that was exactly true. She perceived it the moment he had said it. It was certainly not Neville's grip of what lay beyond death that had been his strength. He loathed death and pain, and had said so again and again. But it was a fine sort of defiance that had inspired him. Simply, he would not be beaten. She had fallen silent when Mr. Morpeth had said that. She had gone on to describe presently, so extraordinarily sympathetic did she find this old man, another incident connected with that deathbed. "Just before the end," she said, "he was a little quieter. It was up in the big room in the front, you know. We haven't used it at all since then. Well, just before the end, he said a rather dreadful thing. He was holding on to my nephew with both hands. He kept his strength, you know, extraordinarily. That was partly what made it all so much more terrible. Well, he seemed to think that Neville would suffer for him, somehow, that it was sure to be so. Well, but Neville took him up and said that he only hoped he would. Of course, he didn't mean it. I don't think any of us knew what we were saying, but it was a fine thing to say, wasn't it?" "It was quite a fine thing to say," repeated Mr. Morpeth tranquilly. She bit her lips sharply. "I see what you mean," she said. "You mean that he didn't mean it." "You thought so too, though," he said gently. "Well, I did, and I do still, but do you think that kind of thing really does happen? People offering themselves for others?" "Why, yes," he said as gently as ever. "The old law even said that it would be so, and the new law underlined it, surely." "I don't understand." "Well, the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. That is in nature, as we say. And the new law says that the children ought to be ready to accept it willingly. That is the whole idea of atonement, is it not?" It seemed very simple put like that, thought Anna. But you don't think in this case," she began, suddenly a little afraid. He spread his hands in a small gesture. "Who in the world can tell?" he said. "We know the principles of things, but no more. In any case, it will be all perfectly well." Somehow, then, when he left her an hour later, she felt reassured all round. This morning, for the few minutes after the opening of Neville's letter, and before the old gentleman's arrival, she had been conscious of a considerable interior disturbance. Now, though he had uttered scarcely a word to reassure her directly, though even he had superficially corroborated all her fears, she was aware of comfort. It was not that he had taken anything away, rather he had drawn pointed attention to the facts, but he had seemed to present them in a new sort of setting, and they looked quite different. There remained Enid Bessington, there remained Jim's altered position and prospects, there remained even more than a suspicion that Neville was not entirely satisfactory. Yet the air had changed. She sat again in the window seat, staring out at a dancing mayfly that had rashly left the far bank to adventure himself into the gardens whose scent, perhaps, was drawing him. She was thinking steadily, and with a restored tranquillity, of this new setting of ideas, and simultaneously had her own attention fixed on the mayfly. He was dancing up and down in a frenzy of delight. Now, for a fleeting instant, he tapped the glassy surface of the stream. Now he whirled a couple of feet above it. "It'll be all right," she whispered to herself, thinking of the engagement. The mayfly was nearing safety. One more whirl would land him on the grass. But once more, for the last time, he dipped close to the bank, and as he dipped, a swirl rose to meet him. A dark nose showed for a moment in the midst of the glass and was gone again, and so was the mayfly. She caught her breath for the fraction of a second. "But it's all part of the scheme," she said aloud.